1867, Nebraska became a state. In a sense, it was the beginning of Nebraska. But in another way, it was also an end. The history of Nebraska did not begin in 1867. It had been going on for generations and generations. The Indians here, of course, first, and then the white men, exploring up the Missouri rivers and gradually wondering what lay out across those broad prairies to the west. In the early 1800s came explorers, scouting out across the trails and across the prairie, wondering what lay between the Missouri and the Rockies. And they weren't impressed with what they found. Consider the opinion of Major Stephen H. Long, who visited Nebraska and the prairies in 1820, and returned to Washington to announce that this place was the Great American Desert, a land which would never be suitable for people who depended for their livelihood upon agriculture. And so in the 1840s, when the fever hit the people of Iowa and Ohio and Illinois, the fever that spoke of Oregon and California and their wealth, their fertile grounds, these people never stopped to think of Nebraska as a home. Nebraska to them was the great pathway west. And so their wheels bit into the sand and in the dust of the prairie. And they moved up along the Platte Valley, and they crossed the South Platte River, and they headed north, up over California Hill and onto the dry upland prairies of western Nebraska. And then they came to one of the most amazing places along the entire Oregon and California Trail, a place that had been known to the fur trappers and the traders for many years, because it stood in such great contrast with the prairie that surrounded it, because here, down along the river, in Ash Hollow, was timber and water and fine grass. Only one problem. To reach Ash Hollow, one first had to go down the face of an almost perpendicular cliff. But where else to go? To east, to west, there was no better descent. To go back to the South Platte River would be losing several days and perhaps following out a path that would lead into nowhere. No, for the covered wagon pioneers, there was only one decision. Over the face of Windlass Hill, as it became known, into Ash Hollow and back into the valley of the North Platte. A sheer drop of many hundreds of feet, a testing place of the endurance and the courage of these westward moving pioneers. So our first task is to get that wagon ready for the descent over the hill. The name Windlass Hill itself comes from, I think, mainly tradition. I doubt that there was a windlass up here for the people to use. But at any rate, they had to take elaborate precautions to prepare that wagon, empty it, get the things outside that might be broken in a jarring, jolting descent, and cradle in the arms of mothers and children would be those cherished belongings that had been in the family perhaps for generations. Something brought from the old country maybe, and now crossing the prairies to some new home in California or Oregon. So he locked the wheels, and the horses leaned back in their traces. And the anxiety in the faces of the people are so visible, and the hearts beat faster. Maybe the children are gay and find this an exciting time, but not so for the adults. They realize that the slightest mishap at this point would mean disaster. A destruction of a wagon, a crushed limb. Where would one find a doctor in this godforsaken country? Where would one find the oak to repair a broken wagon wheel? And so the word is caution, care. care, and with all of the painstaking efforts to avoid disaster, disaster would come. The ropes would break, the wheels would slip, and then a tumultuous fall into the bottom of the hollow. But in the beginning, this was the land of the Indian. Ash Hollow tells the story of these people. As a matter of fact, it tells the story of their ancestors. Because here in this valley, archaeologists have found remnants of the civilization who were the forerunners of the American Indian, for sure. And so the Indian had been here for years, and when the white men came, he was to become one of the most misunderstood figures in our history. Can you imagine what the Easterner thought about the Indian? Had he read the tales of Hiawatha, the noble savage, the tall, straight, handsome, intelligent child of nature? And what did they see? Too often when the wagon trains moved along the trail through the eastern portions of Kansas and Nebraska, the first Indians they saw were the Indians that had been the victims of the contact with white men for too many generations of disease and whiskey and degradation. And now what they saw out here in the prairie was that noble savage. His beautiful Indian villages, his teepees. The horse Indian of the plains was truly that noble savage. And yet the white men still misunderstood him. He failed to perceive that because these were primitive people, they were not simple people. Their culture is very, very complicated. The placing of a teepee was dictated by generations of practice and by countless religious beliefs. The inscriptions upon a teepee, the form of the Indian dance, the placing of the cook fire, these things were not matters of chance. They were matters of religion, matters of custom, and many times a matter of taboo. Now, for example, these white people came out here trying to read into the Indian civilization the same kind of civilization white man possessed. That is, the kind of civilization in which people follow a leader, a single leader. But the Indians did not have this kind of institution. And it was for the white man to establish the idea of the chief. And so Nebraskans, that is, those traveling Nebraska at this time at least, continued to live this erroneous conception of what the American Indian was like. And when he came here into Ash Hollow and began to penetrate the very heart of the Sioux country of western Nebraska, he was bringing with him now the white man's culture, which would have a tremendous impact upon these Indians, would bring a transformation in their life, and for many would bring end of life itself. But nevertheless, nothing so fascinated the prairie traveler as did the sight of the Indian, his villages, and his dances. The organization of the wagon train was one of the most important jobs that faced the Western pioneers. To select, first of all, a capable leader, a man who knew the land, a man who could control the people under his jurisdiction in the wagon train. And to form up this wagon train with great discipline. This was not a matter of every man for himself. There was organization in this wagon train, a set place in line for each wagon, a set responsibility for each driver. And the wagon master periodically would send out the scout to check the way ahead. And one can only imagine the wonderment of the scouts reporting back what the land ahead held for them. Perhaps one scout saw a group of Indians on the move, and the travois used by the Indian squaws to carry the heavy hides of the teepee and the other equipment. The poles lashed one to each side of the animal and the woman riding astride, slowly dragging this travois, loaded with its hides, maybe a child or two finding a place among the folds of the furs and the hides, moving on to a new hunting ground or to a place where there was better grass. And the scout returned to the wagon master to tell of these fascinating sights that lay ahead of the wagon train, but more important, he was to find the water holes and to find the grass and direct this wagon train along the safest and the easiest path. Much depended upon this scout, and upon the intelligence and really the sense of leadership that the wagon master exhibited. Because now the fate of scores of women and children and men were in his hands. They had to find grass, they had to find water, and always they had to think of the presence of the Indian. Because even though through the first years of the westward movement, the Indians caused little trouble for the wagons, there was always that threat. And with each wagon, there rode an invisible passenger. And all knew he was present too. His name was Death, and he could come in any shape and form. An accident, a child bitten by a rattlesnake, cholera. This was probably the most dreaded disease of the people who moved along the trail. And nothing would send them more into the realm of fear than the word that cholera had struck along the trail. They didn't know what caused it. Along the trail, we're told that bags of beans were found by one group of people, and they said, why throw away the beans? And the word was, well, cholera was caused by beans. So immediately, throw away all of those hundreds of pounds of beans that had been packed along the trail ever since they left Westport. But cholera was to be avoided. And as you entered into Ash Hollow, you knew why. June 19th, 1849. Rachel Pattison, 18 years of age, traveling on the trail with her parents and her husband of only 3 months, Nathan. Rachel and the other members of her party must have seen the graves along the trail. This trail was known as the Trail of Mother's Tears because of the children's graves that were hastily dug along the ruts. And they, like other people, must have seen the rude crosses and the hastily scrawled messages on pieces of wood that bore the names of loved ones who had died and were buried far from home. But Rachel was young, vibrant, with everything to live for, and I'm sure, like most young people, must have felt that death could not touch her. But that night, Rachel was dead. Cholera had taken her from the earth, and she was buried near the mouth of Ash Hollow. A few wagons remained behind, the grieving parents, the young husband. The dust of the departing wagon train lay over the hollow. And the young husband laid Rachel to rest.
When we climb the highest hill some morning, when we left the valley far behind, when we pass the road last end, we'll be welcomed by a friend who's been watching o'er us as the trail we climb. Then he'll take us walking through the garden, and we'll rest where all is calm and still. Then we'll wipe away each tear, every pain and every fear, when we stand upon the highest hill.
And when their wagons turned then to follow on the trails they left behind forever, a part of themselves. It's said here in western Nebraska that Rachel Pattison still keeps watch over the valley. That on moonlight nights you can see her yet, her calico skirts billowing in the wind. Lovely Rachel searching for the loved ones who left her here in Ash Hollow. The wagon ruts and the remains of campfires were not the only evidence that the white man passed through this country. The trespasser left his deadly reminder, white man's disease, and the morning chant of the Sioux could be heard many times as the mysterious spirit of white man's death settled over the tribes. And as the crude poles were raised and the bodies placed thereon, the Indians knew that white men had passed this way. As part of the ceremony of interment of a departed Indian, prayers would be offered by an elder of the tribe. And one of the most beautiful of these was the Peace Pipe Prayer, in which the man offering his supplications to the spirit world would say, "I raise my pipe toward the east, to my great spirit. You give us light on Mother Earth. I raise my pipe toward the south. You replenish Mother Earth. Give beautiful days and bless us with plants. I raise my pipe to the west. You will bring the end of the day, and may we have peace in the night. I raise my pipe to the north. Bring us buffalo to eat, deer to eat, and skins to make clothes. We ask of our Great Spirit. I touch Mother Earth with my pipe so that all nations will enjoy peace and unity. No wars. May we have joy and food in abundance for all the nations. Great Spirit, hear my prayer and bless us all, we ask. I humbly pray." The symbol of this time, then, was the sod house. And children will be children. The walls are dirt, or the walls are plaster and lath. Children are going to play. And there comes the time for washing, too. And out into the yard comes grandmother to go to the wash tub, use her lye soap, and do the family wash. Cooking time, well, this posed a problem for the sod house pioneer because there wasn't much cooking wood available. And so into the yard to pick up the pile of cow chips that the children had been gathering. Now, there was nothing wrong with cow chips for fire. They burn with great heat, but they burn too fast. And the story's told by the sod house pioneers that through the cooking season with the cow chips, Mommy and Daddy hardly saw one another because Dad was carrying out the ashes when Mother was bringing in the new supply of cow chips. But this is what they had, and this is what they used. Today in western Nebraska, there are many, many people who can count among their descendants the people who lived in the sod houses. As a matter of fact, there are still many sod houses still standing and still in use in western Nebraska. And we can imagine that when the descendants of the sod house pioneers gather, the stories roll fast of life in the sod house, of blizzards on the prairies, maybe of the bugs and fleas that used to infest these buildings, but all part of the great drama of Nebraska's sod house frontier. The symbol of this part of Nebraska is the cowboy and, of course, the cows. This is really the heart of America's range cattle region. It was in Nebraska that the first Texas cattle were grazed, and so our state can lay claim to being the birthplace of the idea of bringing up a cheap cow from Texas and fattening him on Nebraska's grass. We're not many miles away from Ogallala, the queen of the Nebraska cow towns, the end of one of the Texas trails for many years up which those longhorn cattle came. Today, of course, the longhorn cattle is nowhere to be seen, but ranchers in this part of Nebraska run out on their pastures Herefords and other breeds of cattle. These we see here belong to Mr. Clary, on whose land Ash Hollow is located. The brand of the Clary cow is M/C, a proud brand that Mr. Clary says has been in that family since the late 1800s, since his granddad first began to run cattle down Ash Hollow. The Clarys were the first family into this region. Granddad Clary took a timber claim down through the hollow and took his place among the first cattlemen in this part of Nebraska. And today, as we watch these men move the cattle through the hollow, we're not looking at Hollywood cowboys, far from it. We're looking at men whose ancestors stretch back to the beginning of Nebraska's cattle industry. And we're talking now about men such as John McGinley and Henry Anderson and Arnold McCaig and John Barry and Mose Trigo, Ted Fry, Wes Orr, Jay Queen, Albert Kaufman and Dean Emerson, to mention just a few of the men who are still here on the land, whose fathers and grandfathers came out here when this was a land of Indians, a land of prairie fires, and a land of disaster, and conquered this region and made it the heart of Nebraska's great cattle industry. Where did these cowboys come from? Well, from the tales of the old-timers, it does seem as though many of them came here first, after they were disillusioned with life on the homestead farm. And although today many things have changed out here in the prairies, and one of those that I noticed particularly has changed so much is that all we have now are the white cowboys left here in western Nebraska. Had you and I been here in the 1870s and the 1880s, we would have seen a number of Negro cowboys working these herds too. But whether one were Negro or white, it was a hard, brutal life. And some of the cowboys soon tired of driving the cattle along the trail and tending them in the pastures, and some of them went bad. Not too many miles from here is a place where one of the most notorious bad men of the West pulled off a great train robbery, and his name was Sam Bass. And in peaceful pursuits, he was a cowboy. Well, the story of the cowboy, then, is the story of western Nebraska. And it's the story of the conquering of the land that lay in the vicinity of Ash Hollow, where the wagon ruts had passed, where the grass had been devoured by the oxen and the ponies and the horses of the people going west. Now this became the basis for Nebraska's cattle industry. What did the red man think of all of this? These people who crossed his land and disturbed the buffalo. And worse than that, some of them were beginning to stop. They were plowing the ground and putting up their shacks and sod houses. They'd come to stay. And from Washington came representatives of the president to talk with the Indians, to convince them of the need to deal with these white men in peace. During the years when the wagons were moving through Ash Hollow, down into the Platte Valley, the government had made a series of treaties with the Indians. They were particularly desirous that the Indians would stay out of the North Platte Valley and leave the wagon trains alone. They were summoned to conferences at Horse Creek and Fort Laramie and other places in the West, and there the commissioners of the president argued that the Indians should leave the white travelers alone. And if they did, if they consented to stay out of the North Platte Valley and permit the wagons to pass unimpeded, then the government would pay them. Pay them in what were known as annuities, that is, blankets, food, traps, things that the Indian might desire. In 1854, the system was beginning to rub raw nerves. The Indians were dissatisfied. After all, the Platte Valley was their home, had been for generations. And the passage of the wagons was disrupting their entire life. The buffalo herds were scattered. And since the white men had rifles, and the Indian as yet mainly had bow and arrows, the animals were becoming more and more difficult for the Indians to hunt and to kill for their food. And within the tribes, then, we're sure there came a great deal of controversy. The young men calling for war upon the white man, demanding that they be given the weapons and be given the permission of the tribal councils to move upon the wagon trains and upon the white settlers. And to this, the old men counseled peace and caution. Have you not seen the white men who come from the east? They come as thick as the ants from the anthill, they'd say. But the young braves would not listen. And so in 1854, the tension was increasing on the Great Plains. A few isolated incidents of travelers being attacked by Indians, a mail party massacred near Fort Laramie. And when the Indians came in that spring, early summer, into Fort Laramie to collect their annuities, the air was filled with trouble and a growing despair. And at this moment, a Mormon wagon train passed by the Indian encampment, and a cow either wandered away or was stolen by the Indians. And when the owner got into Fort Laramie, he made a complaint and ordered the commandant to fulfill the terms of the treaties and to get the cow back or to get payment for the cow. So Lieutenant Grattan and a handful of men were sent into that Indian encampment to demand the return of the cow or to deliver over into the hands of the army the Indians who had stolen the animal. We'll never know what happened in the Indian encampment, of course. But Grattan, brave but foolhardy, lined his men up, and they had time for only one volley before they were all cut down and slaughtered by the Indians. An isolated trapper who had crossed over the plains for years unmolested by the Indians would now taste the edge of the Indians' anger and would perish. A single wagon moving over the prairie, its occupants unsuspecting the changing mood of the Indian, would find itself waylaid and its inhabitants attacked by screaming savages. And now the plains were to burst into flames. And from Washington came word that the Army must take steps to solve this Indian problem before it became any worse. General Harney, an experienced Army officer then in Europe, was summoned back to the United States to take command of the army that was to bring justice and retribution to the Indians in the prairies. With 1,200 men, a sizable army for that day, consisting of infantry, cavalry, they were known as dragoons at this point, and artillery, the party moved up the Platte Valley along the Oregon Trail until the soldiers came to Ash Hollow. Over Windlass Hill, into the hollow to camp. And the scouts reported back to General Harney that northwest of the hollow, just a few miles across the Platte in the valley of what was known then as the Blue Water Creek, a sizable Indian encampment. Apparently a peaceful village, but then one never knew. So Harney sent out his scouts, and his scouts reported back that the village was ready and open for an attack. Harney went forward to talk with Little Thunder, the leader of this band of Sioux, and they talked and they argued, and it became very obvious the reason that Harney had gone forward to talk. It was not to discuss the problems of the prairie. It was not to find out whether or not this band of Sioux was in reality a part of that episode at Fort Laramie in the Grattan Massacre. No, treachery and deceit were not the sole province of the Indian, because by Harney's own words, we know that he went forward under the flag of truce in order to give his soldiers time to get into position. The flag of truce was cast down. Harney and his aides galloped back to the lines. And from all sides, the withering fire of white man's wrath entered into the valley of Blue Water Creek and on the unsuspecting Indians. And the Battle of Blue Water Creek was underway. The smoke of battle had cleared away. 86 Indians had been killed. To the soldiers, 4 killed, 7 wounded, and 1 missing, by Harney's count. So with the prisoners in chains and ropes, Harney and his troops prepared now to march farther up the valley, but before they left Ash Hollow, a small sod fort was built and named Fort Grattan. So with his prisoners, Harney continued on to Fort Laramie and then headed north out onto the Nebraska and Dakota plains, taking wherever he went the message of the white man's strength and merciless power. For a few years, the prairie was to be quiet, but the Civil War would end that. And then fear again would stalk the Nebraska frontier, and it would last for nearly 40 years. And finally, the Indian was to be crushed. The Mormon faith, established by Joseph Smith in New York, had been one that had attracted difficulty from the outset. And the Mormons were driven from New York to Ohio, to Missouri, and then to Illinois. And finally, in 1846, Joseph Smith was lynched by an irate Illinois mob. And Brigham Young, the next leader of the Mormons, decided that the people of his faith would have to move west to Deseret. They attempted to stay away from the other emigrants, whom they called Gentiles, by traveling on the north side of the river, and this is really the main route. And by the 1850s, had we stood here in Windlass Hill and looked to the north, we would have seen one of the most fantastic sights of American history. Thousands of people walking across the prairies on their way to the Great Salt Lake Valley. Families divided into parties, and each one of these parties given a two-wheeled cart into which were loaded their belongings and their children. And then the Mormon handcart pioneers, for the most part foreigners, poor, desperate people escaping from the persecution to head for religious freedom in the heartland of America. The hardships were incredible. Many of these people died from cholera and from the raging blizzards which caught them in the Wyoming prairies in the 1850s. But still they moved, the Mormon handcart pioneers, a symbol of the faith that could not be quenched. Although there was constant danger and always the lurking shadow of death, the emigrant and the settler found time for enjoyment. Foreign visitors to America in these days expressed their amazement about these people. One moment they were dusty and tired and dirty from 20 miles, hard days' work along the trail. But they stopped, and the foreigners said in 5 minutes they'd found a fiddler, a level piece of ground, and they were ready to dance. Happy, wonderful times. The kids packed away in the wagons or nearby one of the swirling squares, and it was time for Mom and Dad to have a good old-fashioned hoedown.
Remember the story, Valley, left in a tornado. son, remember the story while he been left in a promenade. Now all four ladies for the rest of the ring, and when you get there, you balance and swing, and when you was drunk, remember the story while he been left in a promenade. Now all four ladies for the rest of the ring, and when you get there, you balance and swing, and when you was drunk, remember the story while he been left in a promenade. Now all four ladies for the rest of the ring, and when you get there, you balance and swing, and when you was drunk, remember the story while he been left in a promenade. Swing her high and whirl her low, round and around you go. You up and then left with the old left hand, the punch her ladies are right on the grin. Right to left, go round the ring, the hand over hand, and hear me sing. You meet your honey and give her a swing, promenading around you go.
But nothing stopped the frontiersmen. And in the 1860s and the 1870s, with the coming of the railroad, the people were beginning to move onto the land. Covered wagons no longer passed through Nebraska. And the signs of civilization appeared. There were men bearing stars on their vests, the sheriffs. There were women in the towns. And in every frontier community, one sure sign that civilization had come. Somebody opened a saloon. just as Miss Kitty has been telling us for years, the saloon was the center of life in a frontier community. In Ogallala, the Crystal Palace, the largest building in town, was used for many, many events. So on Sunday morning, perhaps a few of the fellows and gals still left from the Saturday night spree, the prairie pastor or the prairie priest walked through the swinging doors to bring the message of God and his living Son to those who would listen.
Magnificat anima mea Dominum, et exaltavitus spiritus meus in Deo solitari meo, qui fecit me magna qui potene, et sanctum nomen eus, feci potentiam in brachio suo, dispersit super vomante cordis suae, deposuit potentiam de sede, et exaltavit humilis. Hostia, quae celi pandis hostium, bella primunt hostilia, torobe fer hostilium.
So what has endured from this time? Certainly the land is still here and the beauty of this setting. And what of the faith? America in the 19th century built upon a deep religious conviction, and Nebraska was part of that faith. And if we would seek the foundation of the pioneers' heroism, and if we would seek the faith that we need for today, it is there in the cross, the sign of the gentle man from Galilee. And we have talked about the people who were the pioneers of a century ago who passed through Ash Hollow as a part of the making of the American West in Nebraska. They desired a better life, and this started them on this journey. Their faith helped them overcome the obstacles that nature and man placed before them. These men of 1867 created a free land, and they did it with their strength and their determination. Where are you bound, men of 1967? What will generations yet unborn say of you? Look above Windless Hill and see there the great firmament which is one of your frontiers. Will we conquer it? Look to our sprawling, growing cities, so distant from the setting here of Ash Hollow. Can we conquer the frontiers there of ignorance and poverty and hopelessness? We honor the pioneers of western Nebraska, and I wonder what future historians will have to say of us. Were we equal to the tasks of this, our time? Do we have the will, the ability, the hope to make this world of ours into one in which each man is still of value? Will the tracks we leave behind us be as clearly etched for future generations to see as those that today lie on Windless Hill?
Beautiful Nebraska, peaceful prairie land, laced with many rivers and the hills of sand. Dark green valleys cradled in the earth, rain and sunshine bring abundant birth. Beautiful Nebraska, as you look around, you will find your rainbow reaching to the ground. All these wonders by the master's hand, beautiful Nebraska land.
It was about a month ago that we left the Missouri River down there at Independence, Missouri, headed out along the trail on our way to Oregon. More recently, it was just a little more than a week, about 10 days ago, that our wagon train was at Fort McPherson. And many things have happened in these 10 days that have passed since our leaving old Fort McPherson. We're camped here tonight, let's imagine, if you will, we're camped in the Ash Hollow after a thrilling day in which our wagon train has come to the edge of Windlass Hill, an exciting time of our wagons coming down that large hill that you see over there behind me. Before we begin to talk about the things, though, that would have happened to our wagon train today, let's look back over these last 10 days, because many, many things have happened. And of course, what I'm going to talk to you about now are things that happened to actual wagon trains. I'm not making these things up. These are things that actually happen. And let's just think for a moment now that perhaps these were also happening to us in our wagon trains as we moved along the prairie. Remember now, it's about the 1st of June. And out here in the prairies of Nebraska, 1st of June is the time of storms. And naturally, practically every night, it seemed, to us at least, as we moved in our wagons, we ran into a late afternoon or evening thunderstorm. The storms, the likes of which we'd never seen back in Illinois, with the sharp lightning and the terrific winds and the hail. And so one of the things that we found so difficult to understand and to handle were these storms that struck us every evening. Always there was Indian dangers. We weren't seeing many Indians probably here in this year that we're moving along the trail, but there was always that nagging fear that somewhere over that next divide or along that canyon we would find Indians. And there was one young man in our train that just seemed to have an unreasonable fear of the Indians. And as we've traveled along the trail for a month, there have been a few young wise guys in our wagon train that actually just love to play tricks on him. And one night when we were camped down along the Platte, and this young fellow was out watching the stock, 2 young men crept up on him and pretended they were Indians. And just as he was ready to fire, they screamed the blood-curdling cry of the Indians. And the young man threw down his gun, ran to the Platte River, and plunged in and drowned himself. A practical joke that ended in a disaster for this young man with his incredible fear of the Indians. And then, speaking of our stock, the problem is water. The Platte River sometimes is running dry now, and the only places the cattle can drink are from little pools that are out along the trail. And if any of you have been to western Nebraska, you've seen that wherever water stands in pools, so many times there's a little white film, looks like salt, that lies around the edge of the pool. This is what we call alkali. And alkali would poison the cattle, would really create a disease within them and not take away their thirst, but actually just turn them into fever-ridden beasts that just went wild. And the only way we could treat them would be in the evening when we came into our camp, is to take rinds of bacon and force this grease down the oxen's throat, and hopeful that in time they would get over their fever and again would be useful for us. Always, though, there was the disaster that just seemed to plague every wagon train that went along. Always the little accidents, like day before yesterday, a man and a boy went out to hunt for some cattle that had been stampeded by the evening storm. And they were gone 4 days. before they stumbled back up into the trail, nearly starved and nearly out of their minds from being lost in the prairie. And there was the little boy who'd been sent, like almost all of little boys, out to gather buffalo chips and firewood for the evening fire. And he reached over to pick up some firewood that he saw along a little ravine, and he was bit by a rattlesnake. And that night, when he came into camp, his arm was all swollen out of size. And within 2 days or so, that young boy would be dead. And there were the accidents that just nobody could foresee, like the little girl who was sitting up on the edge of the wagon. Her father had stopped along the trail to check the team's harness. And he got back in the wagon seat, and he sent the team forward with a lurch. The little girl fell out under the wheels of the wagon. And right along that trail, then a grave of a little 2-year-old girl, dead by the accident of her father's wagon passing over her body. There's one incredible story that one wagon train tells us of things that happened one evening when they were camped down here in the Platte, south of us, where we are tonight. Here they pulled in, and one mother came to the head of the wagon train and said that her little boy, who had an accident, he just stepped on some thorns, everybody going barefoot, of course, but his foot had become infected. And that night, the boy was out of his head with fever. And the infection had spread clear up his leg. And the men looked the boy over, and they saw immediately that he was close to death. The only thing that could save his life would be the amputation of his leg. And so the word went around that camp that night asking who had ever done this or who had ever seen it done. And it turned out there was a young boy there in the camp who had had a year or so in medical school and said that he had seen an amputation performed. And so that night under the stars, with no kind of hospital facilities, the little boy's leg was amputated. Unfortunately, it was not successful. He died and was buried. And the mother later wrote that as her little boy was laid to rest in the prairie, she looked across the circle of the wagons, and she heard a cry of a newborn baby. And at the other side of the wagon circle that night, a young couple were being married. It's such an interesting thing among the people who traveled the wagon trains to find that there was tragedy, there was disaster, there was the end of life, but there was almost always, the beginning of life through birth and through marriage. Well, the trail itself that went along the North Platte River was probably the toughest part we're going to see. There were days that we went through sand that just almost came up to the hubs of our wagon. And then we came to the came to the Platte River where we had to cross. There was probably nothing that our people in our wagon train had dreaded more than coming up to the South Platte River in this crossing. Because we weren't just crossing now the Little Blue River or one of those small streams we'd seen in the eastern part of Nebraska. We were coming to that Platte River, swollen by the spring melting snow up in Colorado and the spring rains. This was not a dry stream now. This was one that was running full. And it was perhaps down at this point a mile wide. And people feared the quicksands. And in one episode that we know happened, the wagons were bunched up there, hundreds of them, lined up, ready to go out and take their turns across the river, when a herd of buffalo came from nowhere and scattered through the whole wagon train, throwing everything into a mess and postponing the river crossing for emigrants for many precious days. But I think we can say that at this crossing that we call the lower crossing, that's near Brule, Nebraska today, everybody's fear was greater than actuality. And we did get across the river. The quicksands didn't swallow up our wagons. Under the skillful direction of some of our men who were masters at handling the teams and the wagons, we get across. And today, if you stand there along the highway, Highway 30, you can look up the California Hill that's just north of the crossing and see the wagon ruts going right up that hill. The wagon ruts worn by the passage of thousands of wagons coming up out of the crossing of the Platte River. Now, from this crossing, then, they headed north. And this was a kind of a bleak period because they had about 30 miles or more up on the prairie where there was very little water. And it was as I say, a bleak day for these people. It was hot and windy probably, and nothing really to break the monotony of just prairie. And toward the end of that day's travel, if they were lucky enough to get across it in one day, they would see off to the north of them the beginnings of the faint blue outlines of the bluffs along the North Platte River. They'd hasten up their teams. They probably didn't need to be driven along by the people, because by now the oxen probably smelled the water, and they were quickening their step themselves. And all of a sudden, they came to the bluffs on the north side of the river, and they caught their first glimpse of Ash Hollow. What a tremendous, tremendous sight this must have been. And today, as we travel down Highway 26, we can see the same sort of, have the same sort of sensation that these people must have had. As one man wrote, "Suddenly the ground gives way beneath you, the gigantic plains breaks, a new world flashes into view, a lovely wooded dell dotted by shady cedar and ash trees beside the silvery Platte. But all that is 500 feet below you." Nothing more quickly than famous Ash Hollow could have broken the monotony of level plains, or broken the legs of horses, mules, and oxen, let alone the arms, legs, and collarbones of men. No camp on the California Trail will be more distinctly remembered by us than will be Ash Hollow. And that's where we are right now. And over here behind me is the hill that we've got to come down with our wagons. At the very top, you can see a marker placed there by the State Historical Society and the state of Nebraska many years ago to mark the place that's called Windlass Hill. And while we're looking at it there, let's just stop and try to imagine how we would get our wagons down the face of that very, very steep cliff. Well, here are the actual words of one man who brought a wagon train this way in the 1840s. He says, "We reach the brink of a hill, nearly 1/3 of a mile high, which we have to descend to reach the level of the hollow. We detach all the oxen from the wagon except the wheel yoke, lock the 2 hind wheels with the log chain attached to the body of the wagon, and wrap a log chain around the tire so it will cut into the ground when the wagon is in motion. Frequently, the other 5 yoke of oxen are hitched with their heads to the wagon behind. They, being unaccustomed to this treatment, pull back and help to slow down the wagon. I cannot say at what angle we descend, but it is so great that some go as far as to say the road hangs a little past the perpendicular." So this, guys, the way they did it, you see, was to unhitch the team and put 5 of the yoke of oxen. This was a pretty big wagon, apparently, with 6 yoke of oxen. 5 of them behind the wagon. The idea was that then the cattle, being in this unaccustomed place, would plant their feet and hold the wagon back. And then they'd wrap these chains around the wheels of the wagon, and also had taken the chains and wrapped them around the outside of the wheels, making like the chains that your dad puts out his automobile during icy weather. Well, you might ask yourself the question, well, why do they call it Windlass Hill? Well, this is from an episode involving an early wagon train coming along the trail that erected a windlass at the top of the hill. Now, this could be done in a number of ways. I hope you know what a windlass is, because I'm not sure I can explain it. But they would take 2 big posts and drive them down into the ground. At the top of the post, then they'd put a round log across and fasten this probably with iron straps, so that then you would, at the one end, you'd have a little crank, and you'd have an axle set up there. The idea then being that you'd take a big rope, you see, wrap it around that axle, tie the end of it to the wagon, and then with, I can guess, with about 10 guys hanging out of that handle, slowly unwind the rope and lower the wagon down the hill. Now, the windlass didn't last very long. I guess it lasted only long enough to give the name Windlass Hill to this famous place. Other people who came along turned wagons over and tried to use the wheel and the one axle in this windlass fashion. But the point is that no matter how you did it, it was probably a pretty scary time coming down that hill. And you might ask the question, well, why didn't people just go around this place? You've got to keep in mind that we're traveling against time. And we're not the only ones traveling on the trail. There are thousands of other people along with us, and thousands of teams of horses and oxen and mule. And if we want to get some grass for our animals, we're going to have to keep up here in the front. And we don't want to wander off too far away from the trail to find grass. And so actually, this movement west, as I've told you again and again, was something like a great race. We had to keep moving because of our time. We didn't want to get caught in the snows in the mountains of California and up in Oregon. And so we are moving to beat the weather and also to try to make sure that we've got grass for our animals. One thing there is for certain, though, the trip down Windlass Hill was well worth all of the problems and all of the heartaches and I suppose the moments of breathless anxiety. Because once you got down here into the hollow, here for the first time, said all of the immigrant diaries I've read, we found good water. One man said it's the first good water they found down here in the springs of Ash Hollow since they left the Missouri River more than a month ago. And there were trees around. Ash Hollow, named for the ash trees that were scattered through this particular region. And there were berry bushes, all sorts of wonderful bushes bearing fruit for the pioneers now who'd been living on bacon and hardtack and dried bread for many, many days. It was something like it was a relief from the monotony of the trail that they'd been experienced. And all of them were quite happy now to have made that descent into Ash Hollow and now to be going back to the North Platte River. One thing I want to comment upon is that judging from all of the things that I've read, written by the emigrants and the pioneers, pardon me while I stoke us up here, the pioneer apparently was no more neat than the average American camper today. You know, we read in our newspapers and magazines all this talk about keep America clean and the litter bug. So many times I have read the diaries of people who came in here to Ash Hollow, and they said that the place was really a mess. The immigrants never would clean up a campground. They'd cut down trees just for the fun of cutting them down, and there'd be litter scattered all over the place. And so by the 1850s, when an Army lieutenant came through Ash Hollow on a survey trip for the Army, he made the comment that he had heard that once upon a time Ash Hollow was beautiful. But he said it is no longer beautiful. He said the trees are gone, the grass has been destroyed, and he said it's just kind of a mess now. So it shows that all of us Americans have, through all times and all ages, have failed to appreciate the kind of beauty that we have around. Although I think I would add that the pioneer had much less reason, or much greater reason for not worrying about littering the society than we do. To him, he was trying to stay alive. Today, we're just trying to preserve our natural beauty. Another thing that was very interesting for the emigrants was the fact that somewhere in this hollow here, this canyon, was an old log cabin. Nobody knows who built it. The tradition is that it was a trapper's cabin. Well, this cabin, with its fairly good roof, had been turned into a post office. You and I, as we go along here in our wagon train, there's no corner post box that we can go to. There's no post office we can stop at. But we keep writing letters, and every time we meet a group of people heading back east, and you'll remember our commenting on the fact that we meet a lot of these people, we hand them our letters and say, sir, if you get to St. Joe or Omaha or Council Bluffs or someplace, would you mind mailing these letters for us? Now, in the 1840s, when people came down here and they found that log cabin down there, they just put their messages in there. They put their letters there with a little note, please pick up and take east. Or, you know, like maybe I have a relative coming in a wagon train behind me. So I put a big notice there for Uncle Zeke, who's coming along a couple days behind us saying everything is fine in our wagon train. And we're told that the emigrants spent a couple delightful hours there at Ash Hollow, wandering around reading the messages that had been placed there by the people going along the trail and heading out into the North Platte Valley. Well, when we camp in a spot like this, and we know that we've done a good day's work, that trip across the flat up there was a tough one. The descent down Ash Hollow was kind of took our breath away. So we've earned the right here now for an early campfire, and perhaps after our supper, we start to sing. And I wouldn't be surprised, but one of the songs that we would have sung would have been this one. Did you ever hear tell of sweet Betsy from Pike, who crossed the wide prairie with her feller Ike, with 2 yoke of cattle, an old yeller dog, a tall Shanghai rooster, a big spotted hog. Sing to-ra-li-oo, ra-li-oo, ra-li-ay. Now that's an authentic song from this time, and here's the way we would have sung it around the campfire. We would have taken turns making up those verses, and then all of us joining in on the chorus. So the next guy over there would probably sing this verse. Out on the prairie one bright starry night, they broke out the whiskey and Betsy got tight. She sang and she shouted and danced o'er the plain, and embarrassed poor Ike and the whole wagon train. Those of us who are not too shocked would then join in the chorus. Sing too-ral, I-oo-ral, I-oo-ral, I-ay. The Indians came down in a wild yelling horde, and Betsy was scared they would scalp her adored. Behind the front wagon wheel Betsy did crawl, there shot the Indians with musket and ball. Now we all sing. Sing too-ral, I-oo-ral, I-oo-ral, I-ay. The alkali desert was burning and bare, and Isaac's soul shrank from the death that lurked there. Dear old Pike County, I'll go back to you, says Betsy, you'll go by yourself if you do. Sing too-ral, I-oo-ral, I-oo-ral, I-ay. It's well that we'd have a couple of minutes to sit down in the evening and sing songs like that that would reflect the happy times that we were having, because everywhere as we travel along there is tragedy. For example, down here at the mouth of Ash Hollow is a cemetery, the Ash Hollow Cemetery, which contains the grave of a young girl, a girl by the name of Rachel Pattison. Today we can see, as we note here in this photograph, the actual gravestone that was found over her grave, the name Rachel Pattison and the date 1849. We don't know much about this young lady's life or about her death. I've heard several stories. One is that she was killed by Indians when she went down to the spring for water. The other is that she died of cholera. Either, of course, is a possibility. And speaking of disease, we've noted it all along the trail, haven't we? And one of the curious things that perhaps we've noticed the last few days, we came up here across the uplands approaching Ash Hollow, is that every once in a while we'd find a big bag along the trail. You'd open it up and it'd be the same thing, filled with white beans, dried beans that people were carrying with them. You'd ask why they threw them away. Well, it's because as the cholera, that dreaded disease, swept through their wagons, many of them believed that it was caused by those beans that they ate, and so everybody was throwing them away. Just another testimony, those empty sacks and those sacks of beans along the trail, testimony to the danger that was always with these people as they moved west. Coming here to Ash Hollow also reminds us of our Indian heritage. This is a marvelous place to show that life has been very, very lengthy out here in Nebraska. As a matter of fact, down this hollow here, down the canyon here to the west, there are the places where our archaeologists have found a cave, a series of caves, in which they have uncovered the remnants of an ancient culture, long, long before we had written history, thousands of years ago. And they call this the Ash Hollow culture. There is also the story that this place was a sort of a battleground between the Pawnee and the Sioux. And in the 1830s, we were told that down in this hollow, there was a great battle fought between these two Indian tribes of Nebraska. But also, here in Ash Hollow, there's the story of the white man and his trouble with the Indians, too. Our program at Fort McPherson dealt in part with the Grattan Massacre. You'll remember that over in the National Cemetery there at Fort McPherson, we looked at the gravestone of the 27 soldiers who were killed in that massacre out near Fort Laramie in 1854. I hope you remember that this came about because of the Mormon cow that had wandered away from its owner and gone into the Indian camp. The Indians had killed the cow, and then a group of soldiers from Fort Laramie sent out under Lieutenant Grattan to get the cow back, had got themselves massacred. Well, this was really the first serious piece of Indian trouble we'd had in the West. And it caused a great deal of worry back among the leaders of our government in Washington. And so orders were sent out by the War Department that an army would be sent out along the trail to find the Sioux Indians and to punish them. The leader of this force was to be a man by the name of General William Harney. And he was given a force that consisted of infantry, foot soldiers, cavalry, and also artillery. About 600 men came marching up the valley along that trail you and I have just followed from Fort Kearny. They came down through Ash Hollow, and then they stopped because their scouts came back to report that over here north of us, 7 or 8 miles just beyond the little town of Llewellyn, there was a large encampment of Indians. Well, General Harney, like most Army officers in almost every episode we have of this kind in our history, never stopped to wonder whether or not these were the Indians that had killed Lieutenant Grattan or not. But he sent his force forward. The infantry crossed the North Platte River and started up toward the Indian village. The cavalry were sent so that the Indians couldn't see them around to the back of the Indian village. Now, as the soldiers approached, in due time the Indians saw them. And a number of the Indians came out to try to talk with the general. Little Thunder turned out to be the chief of this Brule Sioux band. He came down and he asked the general what he and his men wanted, and the general said, "We want the men who have killed Lieutenant Grattan." And Little Thunder said, "Well, that was not any members of my band. We are a separate group." Historians pretty well agree that this band of Brule Indians under Little Thunder had not been involved in this massacre out by Fort Laramie. But General Harney went on saying that, well, you Indians have been raiding the settlers, or the immigrants as they moved along. You've disrupted the mails. And he said, and we're going to fight you unless you hand over the men who have been committing these deeds. Now, there's a great deal of controversy about this battle, because there are some who believe that General Harney went forward to talk to Little Thunder under a white flag for only one reason, and that was to give his cavalry time to get around behind the Indian village. Well, whatever happened, I mean, why ever Harney followed this course of action, he broke off his meeting with the Indian chief. He went back to his lines. He ordered the infantry to attack. They broke the Indians. The Indians started to run back, and just at that moment, the cavalry came sweeping down upon the Indians, killing many, many of them. And one man who witnessed this later wrote, "I never saw a more beautiful thing in my life. When the infantry saw the cavalry coming down in such beautiful style, they gave a yell which resounded far and wide. The Indians threw away everything they had in the world. We, of necessity, killed a great many women and children. We took 40 women and children prisoners, a good many horses, buffalo meat enough to supply a whole company for some time. I do not suppose the Indians in this country ever had such a perfect cleaning out as upon this occasion. They will have cause to remember General Harney for some time." This is what I have always called the Harney Massacre. And it was just the first of a long series of attacks made by white people upon the Indians. It was a measure of the tragedy that was yet to come out here in Nebraska and the West. There were 86 Indians killed. There were 5 wounded. There were 70 women and children captured by the white soldiers and carried to Fort Laramie. Among the white soldiers, 4 were killed and 7 wounded. Following the battle, the prisoners were marched off to Fort Laramie, and a small sod fort was built down by the Platte River, and that fort was named Fort Grattan. Well, there's a great deal of history here in Old Ash Hollow. It's a story of our wagons coming down that great cliff behind us, making our way now out to the Platte. And our eyes are going to be open now for the great landmarks that lie ahead of us to the west. Courthouse Rock, Jail Rock, and Chimney Rock. This is all part of the heritage we have here in beautiful Nebraska.
Beautiful Nebraska, peaceful prairie land, laced with many rivers and the hills of sand, dark green valleys cradled in the earth. Rain and sunshine bring abundant birth. Beautiful Nebraska, as you look around, you will find your rainbow reaching to the ground. All these wonders by the master's hand, beautiful Nebraska land. are so proud of the state where we live. There is no place that has so much to give. Beautiful Nebraska, as you look around, you will find your rainbow reaching to the ground. All these wonders by the master's hand, beautiful Nebraska land.